The email came on a dreary Tuesday morning, its subject line reading, "Explore Hollow Creek, a town forgotten by time." Mark, an avid urban explorer, found himself intrigued. He'd never heard of Hollow Creek, despite his extensive research into abandoned places. The sender was anonymous, the message brief. "Discover the secrets of Hollow Creek. Bring your friends. Midnight this Saturday. Coordinates attached." Mark's pulse quickened as he forwarded the message to his closest friends, Sarah, Jake, and Emily. Each of them had a passion for exploring abandoned places, chasing the thrill of the unknown. They had ventured into forgotten factories, derelict hospitals, and crumbling mansions. But this invitation promised something new and exciting. As they gathered at Mark's apartment to discuss the plan, excitement buzzed in the air. Sarah, the group's de facto historian, had already done some research. "Guys, it's like this place doesn't exist," she said, her brow furrowed. "No records, no maps, nothing. It's as if it just disappeared." "That makes it even better," Jake grinned, always the thrill seeker. "We'll be the first to document it." Emily, the most cautious of the group, voiced her concerns. "What if it's a trap? It could be dangerous." Mark nodded, understanding her apprehension. "We'll be careful. We'll go in, take some pictures, maybe find something interesting and get out. We've done this 100 times." By the end of the night, their plan was set. They would leave early Saturday evening, reaching Hollow Creek by midnight. None of them could shake the feeling that this adventure would be unlike any they had undertaken before. Saturday arrived with a somber sky, thick with gray clouds that threatened rain. The group piled into Mark's old SUV, their excitement mingling with a sense of foreboding. The coordinates led them deep into the countryside, far from any major highways or towns. The journey was long and winding, taking them through dense forests and past decrepit farmhouses. The further they drove, the more isolated they felt. As dusk settled in, an uneasy silence enveloped the car. The usual banter and laughter that marked their trips were replaced with quiet anticipation. "Anyone else feeling off?" Emily finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, it's like the air is thicker here," Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the darkening landscape. Jake, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. "Come on, guys. It's just the thrill of the unknown. This is going to be epic." Mark, focused on the road ahead, couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The GPS showed they were getting closer, but the surroundings seemed to become more foreboding with each passing mile. Tall trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness swallowed the last remnants of daylight. As they turned onto a narrow, unmarked road, the first signs of Hollow Creek began to appear. Broken streetlights lined the way, their bulbs long dead. The remnants of old houses peeked through the overgrown vegetation, their windows dark and hollow. "We're almost there," Mark announced, trying to keep his voice steady. The road led them to an old, rusted gate hanging ajar. A weathered sign, barely readable in the SUV's headlights, read, "Welcome to Hollow Creek." The town lay beyond, shrouded in darkness. As they passed through the gate, the car's headlights illuminated the main street. Abandoned buildings lined both sides, their facades crumbling and overtaken by nature. An old clock tower loomed at the end of the street, its hands frozen in time. "This place is incredible," Jake whispered, awe in his voice. Mark parked the car in the town square, and they stepped out into the eerie silence. The air was thick with the scent of decay and damp earth. "Okay, let's stick together and be cautious," Mark said, his tone serious. "We document what we can and leave before it gets too late." They gathered their equipment and set off, their footsteps echoing through the empty streets. Shadows danced on the walls, and the wind carried faint whispers that seemed to come from all directions. The explorers moved deeper into the heart of Hollow Creek, unaware that the town had already started to awaken. The explorers stepped cautiously onto the cracked pavement of Hollow Creek's main street, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows. The silence was overwhelming, a heavy blanket that smothered any sounds they made. Hollow Creek felt like a place trapped in a different era, forgotten by time and the outside world. "Look at that," Sarah whispered, pointing her flashlight towards an old diner. The windows were shattered, and the sign, now barely legible, read, "Mabel's Diner Est." 1948. The menus, still on some tables, were yellowed with age, and a thick layer of dust coated every surface. Jake, ever the thrill-seeker, pushed open the diner door. It creaked loudly, sending a shiver down everyone's spine. "This place is a gold mine for our blog," he said, snapping photos of the interior. As they explored further, they found more remnants of the town's past. A small grocery store with cans still on the shelves, a barber shop with rusted tools, and a library filled with mildewed books. Each building told a story of abrupt abandonment, as if the residents had left in a hurry, never to return. In the town hall, Sarah found a stack of old newspapers. She dusted them off and started reading. "Guys, listen to this," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The others gathered around as she read an article from the Hollow Creek Gazette, dated October 12, 1963. "Mysterious disappearances plague Hollow Creek," the headline read. The article detailed a series of unexplained vanishings over a few weeks, starting with children and eventually affecting entire families. The town was gripped with fear, and the local authorities were baffled. The final lines were particularly chilling. "The town's residents have vanished without a trace. Hollow Creek stands empty, a ghost town in every sense." "This is creepy," Emily said, looking around nervously. "What happened to them?" Mark shook his head. "Whatever it was, it happened fast. We need to be careful." As night fell, they decided to camp in the town square. They set up their tents near the old fountain, which had long since dried up. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, and the town took on an even more sinister aspect. The clock tower loomed above them, its silent face watching. While they prepared their camp, they heard the first strange noise. It was a soft rustling, like leaves being disturbed. Mark shone his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. As they settled down for the night, the unease grew. The air seemed to hum with a latent energy, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Shadows danced on the edges of their vision, and the faint sound of whispers floated on the breeze. Then, just as they were about to drift off to sleep, a distinct sound broke the silence. The unmistakable echo of footsteps. They were not alone. Hollow Creek was awakening, and its former residents were ready to reclaim their town. The footsteps echoed through the empty streets, growing louder and more distinct. Mark sat up abruptly, his heart pounding. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered urgently. Sarah, Jake, and Emily were already wide awake, their faces pale in the dim light of the lantern. "Yeah, it sounded like someone walking," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's just an animal," Jake suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Mark shook his head. "That was too deliberate. We need to investigate, but stay close together." They grabbed their flashlights and cautiously stepped out of their tents. The town square was eerily quiet, the shadows long and menacing. They moved as a group, flashlights sweeping across the deserted buildings. The sound of footsteps continued, leading them toward the old schoolhouse at the end of the street. The building loomed ominously, its windows dark and broken. As they approached, the door creaked open slowly, as if inviting them inside. "Should we go in?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to," Mark said, trying to muster confidence. "We need to know what's going on." Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay was overpowering. Their flashlights revealed rows of desks, textbooks still open, and a chalkboard with faded writing. The room felt frozen in time, a snapshot of a normal day abruptly interrupted. Jake moved to the teacher's desk and found a leather-bound journal. "Look at this," he said, opening it carefully. "It's a journal from one of the teachers." He read aloud, the words echoing in the silent room. October 1st, 1963. The disappearances have begun. First it was little Tommy, then Sarah. The townsfolk are terrified. We don't know what's happening, but there's a sense of something unnatural at play. October 5th, 1963. More children have vanished. Parents are keeping their kids home, but it doesn't seem to help. They disappear without a trace, as if they were never here. October 10th, 1963. Entire families are gone now. There's no pattern, no clue as to what's taking them. The town is falling into panic and despair. Some say it's a curse. Others whisper about the old legends of Hollow Creek. I fear we're running out of time. October 12th, 1963. I am alone. The school is empty. The town is silent. I write this with trembling hands, not knowing if I will be next. If anyone finds this, know that Hollow Creek is not safe. The spirits of the past are restless. We should have never built on these lands. Beware. A chill ran down their spines as Jake finished reading. The journal confirmed their worst fears. The town's residents had vanished under mysterious, possibly supernatural circumstances. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice shaking. "Not yet," Mark replied, his curiosity and determination overcoming his fear. "There's more to uncover. We need to find out what really happened here." Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and a cold breeze swept through the room. The door slammed shut behind them, and the sound of children's laughter echoed in the halls. The spirits of Hollow Creek were making their presence known, and they were not happy about the intruders. "We have to move now!" Mark shouted. They rushed out of the schoolhouse, the ghostly laughter growing louder and more sinister. As they fled into the night, they realized that Hollow Creek's past was not just a series of tragic events. It was a warning. The town was a trap, and the spirits of its former residents were determined to reclaim it from the living. The group bolted from the schoolhouse, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The laughter echoed behind them, an eerie reminder that they were not alone. They huddled together in the town square, their flashlights flickering in the oppressive darkness. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. It sounded like children. "Ghosts," Jake muttered, his bravado fading. "Real ghosts." Emily looked around, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do now? We need to leave." Mark nodded, trying to stay calm. "We should head back to the car. Maybe we can get out of here before anything else happens." They started toward the SUV, their flashlights casting shaky beams of light on the cracked pavement. As they neared the vehicle, a chilling wind swept through the square, extinguishing their lights. They froze, the darkness pressing in around them. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. They could see their breaths misting in the air. From the shadows, ghostly figures began to materialize. Pale and translucent, they moved silently toward the group, their eyes hollow and filled with a sorrowful rage. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing Emily's hand. They sprinted toward the SUV, but the spirits moved faster, surrounding them with an otherworldly grace. The explorer stumbled to a halt, trapped. One of the spirits, a young woman in a tattered dress, stepped forward. Her eyes locked onto Mark's, and her voice, though faint and distant, carried a chilling authority. "Why have you come to our town?" she asked, her tone both curious and accusing. We didn't mean any harm," Mark stammered. "We're just explorers." The spirit's expression softened for a moment before hardening again. "You disturbed our rest. This town is ours. You must leave, or suffer the same fate as us." Sarah, shaking, stepped forward. "Please, we just want to understand what happened here." The ghostly woman's eyes flashed with anger. "Curiosity brought the doom upon Hollow Creek. You should have heeded the warnings." Suddenly, the spirit surged forward. Cold, spectral hands reached out, brushing against the explorer's skin. The touch was like ice, sapping their strength and filling them with a deep, paralyzing fear. "Get to the car!" Mark yelled, pushing through the spectral figures. The group fought their way to the SUV, scrambling inside and locking the doors. The spirits pressed against the windows, their faces twisted in sorrow and rage. Mark fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the SUV lurched forward, plowing through the ghosts. As they sped away from the town square, the spirits faded into the darkness, their mournful cries echoing in the night. The road out of Hollow Creek seemed to stretch endlessly before them, and the sense of being watched never left. Finally, they reached the rusted gate and drove through it, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly as they left the town behind. They stopped a few miles away, the reality of their encounter sinking in. "What the hell was that?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "Spirits," Sarah replied, her face pale. "The spirits of Hollow Creek. They want their town back." Emily clung to Mark, tears streaming down her face. "We need to leave now." Mark nodded, his determination to uncover the truth battling with the need to get his friends to safety. "We'll leave," he said, his voice resolute. "But we can't ignore what we've seen. We have to find out what really happened to those people." As they drove away from Hollow Creek, the shadows of the past still loomed over them, whispering secrets and warnings. The first encounter with the spirits was a stark reminder that some places are haunted not just by history, but by the restless dead. And the explorers had just begun to uncover the true horrors of Hollow Creek. As dawn broke, the group found a motel on the outskirts of a nearby town and took refuge. Exhausted and shaken, they collapsed into uneasy sleep, plagued by nightmares of Hollow Creek and its restless spirits. By late afternoon, they gathered in Mark's motel room to regroup and decide their next steps. "We can't go back there," Emily insisted, her eyes still red from crying. "It's too dangerous." "We have to," Mark countered. "We need to know what happened. We owe it to the people who vanished." Sarah nodded in agreement. "If we can figure out what caused all those disappearances, maybe we can help the spirits find peace." Jake, though visibly scared, gritted his teeth. "All right, but we need a better plan. We can't just walk back in there like last time." That evening, they prepared more thoroughly. They gathered supplies, researched ghost hunting techniques, and found old maps of Hollow Creek that might help them navigate the shifting layout of the town. Armed with this new knowledge, they set off as night fell, determined to uncover the truth and survive the ordeal. Returning to Hollow Creek, They immediately felt the oppressive atmosphere settle over them. The town was darker, the shadows deeper, and the air thicker with an almost tangible sense of dread. They moved cautiously, sticking close together and marking their path with chalk to avoid getting lost. As they explored, the spirits began to manifest again. This time, they were more aggressive. Ghostly hands reached out from the walls, grasping at their clothing and pulling at their hair. Whispers grew louder, filling their minds with echoes of the town's tragic past. "Stay together!" Mark shouted, trying to keep the group focused. "We need to find the source of the hauntings." They made their way to the town hall, hoping it might hold more clues. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply, and the air felt heavy with the weight of decades-old sorrow. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and ghostly figures flitted through the room. At the center of the hall, they found an old ledger, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. Sarah carefully opened it, reading aloud the final entries. October 12th, 1963. The disappearances continue. The townsfolk are desperate. Some speak of an ancient curse, a pact made long ago with dark forces to protect the town. It is said that the spirits of the sacrificed now haunt Hollow Creek, claiming anyone who dares to disturb their rest. October 15th, 1963. We have tried everything to lift the curse, but nothing works. The spirits grow stronger, feeding on our fear. I fear it is too late for us. If anyone finds this, beware the curse of Hollow Creek. Leave this place and never return. As Sarah finished reading, the room grew colder and the spirits closed in. The group huddled together, their breath visible in the freezing air. Suddenly, the ghostly woman from before appeared, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You know our story now," she said, her voice echoing. "Will you help us, or will you suffer our fate?" "We want to help," Mark said, his voice shaking. "How can we lift the curse?" The spirit's eyes softened slightly. "The curse was born from betrayal and blood. We must find the source of the pact and break it. Only then can we be free." The group exchanged determined glances. "We'll do it," Jake said, his fear momentarily forgotten. "Where do we start?" "Follow the signs," the spirit whispered before fading away, leaving them alone in the freezing darkness. With renewed purpose, they set off, following the clues left behind in the town hall. The spirits, sensing their intent, began to guide them rather than hinder them. The oppressive atmosphere lightened slightly as they moved toward the old church at the edge of town, where they believed the pact had been made. Inside the church, they found an ancient altar stained with dark, dried blood. The air was thick with malevolence, and the walls seemed to pulse with dark energy. Sarah, using the knowledge she had gained from their research, began a ritual to break the curse. As she chanted, the spirits gathered, their forms becoming more defined. The temperature fluctuated wildly, and the building shook as if resisting their efforts. But Sarah continued, her voice strong and unwavering. With a final, powerful incantation, the room exploded with light. The dark energy dissipated, and the spirits began to fade, their expressions peaceful for the first time. The ghostly woman appeared once more, her face serene. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have freed us. Hollow Creek is ours no longer." As the last of the spirits vanished, the oppressive atmosphere lifted entirely. The explorers stood in the now silent church, the weight of their ordeal finally lifting. They had reclaimed Hollow Creek not for the living, but for the spirits who had suffered there for so long. Exhausted but victorious, they left the town behind as dawn broke, the first light of day illuminating a place finally at peace. The group left the church, their bodies and minds heavy with the weight of what they had just experienced. Hollow Creek was no longer as foreboding, but the sense of urgency remained. They needed to leave before the town reclaimed its hold on them. "Let's get back to the car," Mark said, his voice resolute. "We need to get out of here while we still can." They hurried through the streets, the dawn light casting long shadows behind them. The town seemed to sigh with relief, its spirits finally at peace. The explorers knew they couldn't linger. As they reached the town square, the sound of distant whispers returned, growing louder and more insistent. "It's like the town doesn't want us to leave," Emily whispered, clutching Mark's arm. "We have to try," Jake said, his eyes darting around nervously. As they approached the SUV, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The vehicle's tires were slashed, and strange symbols were scrawled on the windows in what looked like dried blood. "How?" Sarah began, but her voice trailed off. The realization that something, or someone, was still trying to trap them in Hollow Creek sank in. "Okay, Plan B," Mark said, trying to stay calm. "We'll have to go on foot." They gathered what supplies they could carry and started toward the gate. The sun was rising, but the town seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Every street looked the same, and the landmarks they had marked earlier seemed to shift and change. "This way," Sarah said, pointing to an alley that seemed to lead toward the outskirts of town. They moved quickly, but the whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to close in. As they turned a corner, they found themselves back in the town square, their escape route gone. The spirits had not vanished completely. They were still watching, still waiting. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped in a labyrinthine maze. "We need to stay calm," Mark said, though his voice trembled. "There has to be a way out." Jake looked around, his eyes wide with fear. "The town is messing with us. It doesn't want us to leave." Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the square, the ghostly woman from the church. Her form was faint, but her presence was undeniable. She pointed toward an old, overgrown path that led out of the square. "Follow the path," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind. "It will lead you to safety." They hesitated for a moment, but the sense of urgency propelled them forward. The path was narrow and winding, cutting through the dense forest that surrounded Hollow Creek. The whispers faded as they moved, replaced by the sounds of nature waking up. As they neared the edge of the forest, the trees thinned, and they saw the road ahead. Relief washed over them as they stumbled onto the pavement, leaving the haunted town behind. "We made it," Emily said, tears of relief streaming down her face. Mark turned to look back at the forest. "We did it. We freed them." Sarah nodded, exhaustion etched on her face. "But we have to make sure no one else goes back there. Hollow Creek needs to be left alone." They walked down the road until they found a small gas station where they could call for help. As they waited for the tow truck, they sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The experience had changed them all, leaving a mark that would never fully fade. When the tow truck arrived, they piled into the cab, grateful to be moving away from Hollow Creek. The driver, an older man with a knowing look in his eyes, glanced at them. "You kids were up near Hollow Creek, weren't you?" They nodded, too exhausted to explain. "Best to leave that place alone," he said, shaking his head. "Some places are haunted for a reason." As they drove away, the sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the last traces of night. They had escaped Hollow Creek, but the town and its spirits would forever haunt their memories. Days turned into weeks, and the group tried to resume their normal lives. Yet Hollow Creek haunted them, its specters and eerie whispers invading their thoughts. Sleep brought no relief, only nightmares filled with ghostly figures and shifting streets. They had escaped physically, but mentally, the town's grip was unrelenting. Mark was the first to crack. He became obsessed with the town, poring over maps and old records, seeking any information he could find. His apartment became a chaotic mess of documents, photos, and notes scrawled in frantic handwriting. He barely slept or ate, consumed by the need to understand Hollow Creek's mysteries. "Mark, you need to stop," Emily pleaded one evening, her eyes filled with concern. "It's driving you insane." "I can't," he replied, his voice hollow. "I need to know why it happened. I need to know why we were chosen." Emily backed away, tears in her eyes. "You're scaring me, Mark. This isn't healthy." Meanwhile, Sarah became increasingly paranoid. She saw shadows moving in the corners of her vision, heard whispers when she was alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind made her jump. She stopped going out, afraid that the spirits of Hollow Creek had followed her. Jake tried to drown his fear with alcohol, spending nights in bars attempting to forget. But the more he drank, the clearer the memories became. The spirits' faces haunted him, their sorrow and rage etched into his mind. He became belligerent, getting into fights and alienating his friends. The group's once strong bond began to fray. Arguments erupted over trivial matters, their tempers short and patience thinner. The shared trauma of Hollow Creek had united them in the moment, but now it was tearing them apart. One evening they gathered at Sarah's apartment, trying to find solace in each other's company. The atmosphere was tense, each of them a bundle of nerves ready to snap. "We need to talk about what happened," Mark said, his voice strained. "We need to understand it." "There's nothing to understand," Jake snapped, his eyes bloodshot. "We survived. That's all that matters." "But why us?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Why were we the ones to lift the curse? What if it's not over?" Emily, sitting quietly in the corner, finally spoke up. "I've been seeing things," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Shadows, whispers. I think the spirits are still with us." Mark's eyes widened. "We need to go back," he said, the desperation in his voice clear. "We need to find out if it's really over." "Are you crazy?" Jake yelled, standing up abruptly. "We barely made it out alive. I'm not going back to that place." "We have to," Mark insisted. "If we don't, we'll never be free of it." The argument grew heated, voices rising and tempers flaring. The tension that had been simmering for weeks boiled over, and they turned on each other, blaming and accusing. "You're obsessed, Mark!" Emily shouted. "You're dragging us all back into that nightmare!" "Better obsessed than a drunk!" Mark shot back. "At least I'm trying to do something about it." Jake lunged at Mark, fists swinging. The room exploded into chaos, furniture overturned and voices raised in anger. Sarah screamed for them to stop, but the rage and fear that had been building since their escape found its release in violence. Finally, they pulled apart, panting and bruised. The room was a mess, and the fragile threads of their friendship lay shattered on the floor. "We can't go on like this," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "We need help." They agreed, reluctantly, to seek professional help. Therapy sessions began, each of them working through their trauma individually. But the damage was done. The once close friends drifted apart, each haunted by their own memories and guilt. Hollow Creek had claimed them in a way they hadn't anticipated. They had escaped its physical bounds, but the psychological scars remained. The descent into madness was slow and insidious, a reminder that some places and some experiences leave marks that can never be fully erased. As the months passed, the group's lives continued to unravel. Therapy provided some relief, but the haunting memories of Hollow Creek persisted, gnawing at the edges of their sanity. They remained estranged, each dealing with the trauma in their own way. Despite their efforts to move on, a sinister feeling hung over them, a persistent whisper that Hollow Creek's story wasn't finished. One night, Mark received a call from Sarah, her voice trembling with urgency. "We need to meet. It's important." Reluctantly, he agreed. They gathered at a coffee shop in a neutral part of town, the atmosphere thick with tension and unspoken fears. Emily and Jake arrived, looking equally haggard and worn. "What's this about, Sarah?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with annoyance. Sarah pulled out a worn envelope, placing it on the table. "I found this in my mailbox this morning. It's from Hollow Creek." Mark's eyes widened. "What does it say?" With shaky hands, Sarah opened the envelope and read aloud. "Return to Hollow Creek. The curse is not lifted. You are not free. Finish what you started." Silence fell over the group, each of them grappling with a renewed sense of dread. "We have to go back," Mark said finally, his voice steady but his eyes haunted. "We need to end this, once and for all." Emily shook her head, tears welling up. "How can we? We barely survived last time." "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, her voice firm. "If we don't, this will haunt us forever." After a long, tense discussion, they reluctantly agreed to return to Hollow Creek. They spent the next few days preparing, gathering supplies, and studying the notes and maps they had compiled during their first visit. This time they vowed to be more cautious, more prepared. As they drove back to Hollow Creek, a sense of grim determination settled over them. The town loomed ahead, shrouded in an unnatural mist that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. They parked the car at the edge of the forest and approached the rusted gate, now slightly ajar as if welcoming them back. The town was even more foreboding than they remembered. The buildings seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The whispers started almost immediately, ghostly voices carrying on the wind, urging them to turn back. "We stick together this time," Mark said, gripping a flashlight tightly. "No matter what." They moved cautiously through the streets, heading toward the church where they had first confronted the source of the curse. As they neared the building, the air grew colder, and the whispers became more insistent. Inside the church, the altar stood as they had left it, but the sense of malevolence was stronger. The walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, and shadows danced in the corners of their vision. Sarah stepped forward, her hands shaking but her resolve firm. "We need to finish the ritual," she said, pulling out the notes she had compiled. "It wasn't completed last time. That's why the curse remains." They gathered around the altar, the air growing colder with each passing moment. Sarah began to chant, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. The shadows around them grew darker, and ghostly figures began to materialize, their faces twisted with sorrow and rage. As Sarah continued the ritual, the spirits grew more agitated. The temperature plummeted, and the walls of the church shook as if resisting their efforts. The group stood firm, their determination unwavering despite the terror that gripped them. Suddenly, a ghostly figure emerged from the shadows, the same woman who had guided them before. Her face was filled with both sorrow and hope. "Finish it," she urged, her voice echoing. "End our suffering." Sarah's chant reached a crescendo, and with a final powerful incantation, a blinding light filled the room. The dark energy that had plagued Hollow Creek dissipated, and the spirits began to fade, their expressions peaceful for the first time. The woman smiled sadly. "Thank you," she whispered before disappearing into the light. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the church fell silent. The group stood in the now empty building, the weight of the curse finally lifted. They had done it. They had freed the spirits of Hollow Creek. Exhausted but relieved, they made their way out of the town, the first light of dawn breaking through the mist. As they left Hollow Creek behind, they felt a sense of closure, a peace that had eluded them for so long. They knew that they would always carry the scars of their experience, but they also knew that they had done something good. They had ended the suffering of the spirits and freed themselves from the town's dark grip. Hollow Creek would forever be a part of their past, but they had finally reclaimed their future. The drive back from Hollow Creek was silent, each of them lost in their thoughts. The weight of what they had accomplished and the horrors they had faced settled heavily on their shoulders. They were free of the town's curse, but the memories of their ordeal would linger forever. As they reached the outskirts of the city, they decided to stop at a small diner to regroup. They sat at a booth, the familiar hum of normalcy almost surreal after the events they had endured. Mark broke the silence first. "We did it. We actually did it." Emily nodded, her eyes still reflecting the haunted look they all shared. "But what now? How do we move on from this?" Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. "We try to live our lives. We can't forget what happened, but we can't let it control us either." Sarah, who had been quiet since they left Hollow Creek, finally spoke. "We need to tell our story. People need to know what happened there. Maybe it will stop others from making the same mistakes." They all agreed. It was the only way to find some semblance of closure. Over the next few weeks, they worked together to document their experiences. They compiled their notes, photographs, and recordings, creating a detailed account of Hollow Creek and its tragic history. Their story garnered attention, both from paranormal enthusiasts and those fascinated by unexplained phenomena. It was a way to process their trauma, turning their harrowing experience into something that could help others. Despite their shared ordeal, the group members continued to drift apart. The bond forged in terror was not enough to sustain their friendships in the aftermath. They stayed in touch, but the intensity of their experience made it difficult to return to the easy camaraderie they once shared. Mark found solace in writing, turning his experiences into a book that became a bestseller. He traveled, giving talks about Hollow Creek and the importance of respecting places with dark histories. Sarah pursued a career in research, dedicating herself to uncovering and preserving the stories of other forgotten places. Her work brought her some peace, though the memories of Hollow Creek never fully faded. Jake struggled the most, the trauma manifesting in bouts of anger and depression. He eventually sought help, finding therapy to be a lifeline that allowed him to start healing. He channeled his energy into extreme sports, seeking the thrill to keep his demons at bay. Emily moved away, seeking a fresh start in a new city. She immersed herself in volunteer work, helping others to distract from her own pain. She kept a journal, documenting her thoughts and nightmares, slowly finding her way back to a sense of normalcy. Years passed, and Hollow Creek became a part of their past, a dark chapter that had shaped their lives but no longer defined them. They found ways to move forward, each on their own path, carrying the lessons learned from their ordeal. The town of Hollow Creek remained abandoned, a silent testament to its tragic history. It stood as a warning to those who might venture there, its secrets now laid bare by the group's account. The spirits were at peace, and the town no longer held its dark grip on the living. In the end, they had not only survived Hollow Creek, but had also freed it from its curse. Their lives were forever changed, but they had reclaimed their futures. The ghosts of the past were at rest, and so, finally, were they.